We'll get started. Good morning. My name is Damon Huss. I am from the Constitutional Rights Foundation, as you see on your screen, hosting this webinar on our rights and freedoms. And I am the senior editor and curriculum specialist at Constitutional Rights Foundation. So some of you, if you're teachers especially, you may subscribe to our Bill of Rights in Action magazine, and I edit that magazine, so you'll see my name on that. I'm also joined this morning by my co-host, Gracie, who I will allow to introduce herself right now.
Hi, I'm Gracie Rice. I'm a junior at Gentry Academy in St. Paul, Minnesota.
I'm going to start off giving you a little bit about this first part you see on your screen, our rights and freedoms, talking a little bit about the Constitution. And as we did promise, of course, this will be a webinar that involves a visitor from outer space. And so as you see here, this image shows you a little bit of a preview of what you're going to be experiencing later in this webinar. And you'll wonder perhaps what this has to do with our rights and freedoms, and we'll tell you. But I'd also like to, well, note if anyone knows where this image comes from, then you'll get extra credit points if you put that in the chat, where this particular unidentified flying object originates from, which movie. You'll see this slide shows you the Constitutional Convention, 1787. And no, this doesn't have to do with a visitor from outer space. But in just a minute, just this minute, I'm going to show you the shortest summary I can give you of the Constitution, because that'll set up what we're talking about when we talk about rights and freedoms. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, there were really three main principles that the delegates there to the Constitutional Convention wanted to express in the Constitution and what our government would be like. And the first principle has to do with federalism. They wanted to balance the power between the central government and the state governments. The second was to separate the powers within the government between our three branches, as we know, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. And thirdly, they wanted to set up a Republican form of government, or a representative democracy. So there wouldn't be direct democracy to make our decisions, but we would elect representatives. That's the Constitution in a nutshell. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention, wait a minute. Yeah, mostly delegates to the Constitutional Convention, except for, well, okay, we'll get to the aliens, But right now, they had to deal with an important question, which was, what about our individual rights? Federalism, separation of powers, Republican government don't directly address our individual rights. And should we put a list of those individual rights in the Constitution? To answer this question, the delegates disagreed. You have James Madison here and George Mason, both were delegates from Virginia. And James Madison thought, no, we don't need a list of our rights. We don't need a separate list or a Bill of Rights, because that would, one of the main reasons he gave was that would limit how many rights. We would list what they are, and then what if there are other rights that we haven't thought of that we need to articulate? We don't want to limit it just to what's on the list. So we shouldn't even put that list in there. The Constitution is sufficient to address the needs of people for having their rights articulated. George Mason, however, disagreed. He said we have to have a list of rights, because if we don't put that list in, then we're not going to have any that are guaranteed, and the government could infringe on our basic rights. And George Mason ended up being one of the three delegates who didn't even sign the Constitution, because he thought it has to have this Bill of Rights in it. Well, after the Constitution was then ratified in 1791, there finally was a Bill of Rights that was added to the Constitution, which in the form of amendments. And 10 amendments were added to the Constitution. Originally, there were 12, but the first two didn't get ratified. And so our Bill of Rights that we have today are the 10 amendments that did get ratified. And the Bill of Rights, along with the Constitution, became the law of the land. What are the Bill of Rights? We start with the First Amendment, many of us are familiar with the fundamental rights in the First Amendment. Those fundamental rights are have to do with freedom of religion, both the separation of church and state and the free exercise of religious beliefs. Now, separation of church and state is not a phrase that comes from the First Amendment. It is the Establishment Clause that gives us that idea of separation of church and state. Other fundamental rights, of course, include the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to assemble peaceably and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Then we have the Second Amendment, which includes phrases, the right to keep and bear arms, related to a well-regulated militia. And the Third Amendment, which protects citizens from soldiers being quartered in their homes. The Fourth Amendment, which protects against unlawful search and seizure by the government. This usually has to do with some police power being limited, so there can't be unreasonable searches and seizures of ourselves or our property. The Fifth and Sixth Amendments have to do with the courts and have to do with the rights of those who are accused of crimes. This was very important to the framers of the Constitution. And in the Fifth Amendment, these are the protections that are given to us. There will be an indictment by a grand jury. Very importantly, there will be due process of law, protection of due process of law, and that will come up again in just a moment when we look at the 14th Amendment. The right against having to testify against yourself. So that's why criminal defendants do not have to take the stand and testify. There will be no double jeopardy. So once someone is acquitted of a crime, they can't be tried again for the same crime. And that there will be just compensation for any property that the government takes from anyone. This is closely related to due process. The government takes your property, the government has to compensate you for the value of that property. The Sixth Amendment specifically has to do with the right to a speedy public trial. If you're accused of a crime, you need to be informed of the accusation against you. And very importantly, you have a right to have an attorney, which is a person who speaks for you and defends you in that criminal case. You have a right to have an impartial jury of your peers to go forward if you are on trial for any kind of crime. And you have the right to confront your witnesses, to confront the witnesses against you, as well as having your own witnesses to give your side and your defense in a case. I see a couple of people might have chimed in about where that UFO came from before we go on. I see Lost in Space. Good guess. It comes from Plan 9 from Outer Space, which if any of you have seen that movie, then you'll know why I'm smiling right now. Noted to be often one of the worst movies ever made, highly entertaining. All right, moving right along. Let's see, the Seventh Amendment is also in the Bill of Rights, and this guarantees a jury trial for a civil case, and it's one of the few places, one of the only places I can think of really in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights where a dollar amount was specified, $20. Now, that was in 1791. And since then, it's been clarified. This amendment really relates to only federal cases, and there is a right to have a jury. The jury does not have to be 12 jurors like we think of for a criminal case. The Eighth Amendment protects against cruel and unusual punishment, including excessive fines for any kind of crime that someone might be convicted of. The Ninth Amendment protects general kind of protects rights that we don't have, meaning that the Bill of Rights would not just be limited to what's in those first amendments 1 through 8, but there could be other rights that get articulated later. And then the 10th Amendment reserves powers to the states. So the founders included this Bill of Rights in the Constitution to be added to the Constitution, and to date we have 27 amendments to the Constitution. Additional amendments that came along that also show us fundamental or basic rights include the Civil War amendments, or what are often called, historians call them, the Civil War amendments, because they are a direct result of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment ensured that due process of law, or that fair process of law, of fair treatment of everyone under the law, would not just be applied to the federal government, but would also be applied to state governments, so that state governments could not take away your Fifth Amendment right to due process of law. And there would be equal protection under the law. So everyone within a state would be equally protected by the laws. The laws don't protect some people, but not others. Ensured the right to vote, and that it can't be denied based on race, color, or previous servitude, meaning those people who had been enslaved would not be denied the right to vote just because they had been enslaved before. And later, of course, we have the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920, which guaranteed women's right to vote in the United States. So those are the fundamental rights that we see, not just in the Bill of Rights, but also in some of the later amendments that made sure that we have this fundamental right. And now we're going to come to the second part of this webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to Gracie.
Okay, so we're going to do this activity, Visitor from Outer Space, and just kind of put things into perspective for you guys of a unique situation and what you would do in that situation. Imagine it is the year of 2080. You're watching your holographic television and a special news bulletin comes on. This strange creature appears on your screen and informs you that it has taken over America. You've rapidly flipped through all 10,000 channels and it appears on every one. It says, "Attention, I am Sithgar from the planet Nortu Tiznok. Just as I've taken over television, I will take over your lives. But I come in peace. I've realized that individual freedom means a great deal to citizens. Therefore, I will not take away all of your rights. You have a choice. From a list of basic rights, you may choose 3 to keep. Think really carefully before you vote, as all your rights as citizens will end except for those that you choose. The list of choices will now appear on the screen."
So here you have the many of the fundamental rights. You'll notice not all of the rights that I had described earlier are included on this list, but the First Amendment, for example, does include all of the basic fundamental rights of the First Amendment, but we didn't include the Third Amendment or the Ninth Amendment and others. But other essential fundamental rights are included here. In the chat area, you will see a link to the page that you see on your screen now, which is a list of those fundamental rights that were on that slide that you just saw. It said choose only 3. If you need to, on this page, you can slide to the right to see the 8th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. But on this page, you'll see the instructions at the top. So a couple of folks have written here, say under the First Amendment, someone wrote, "The First Amendment is important because it guarantees the right to express our ideas and beliefs. The First Amendment makes us who we are." Under the Second Amendment, someone wrote, "This gives us the ability to protect ourselves and our communities." I see we have a raised hand here, ratification, and that's the process by which an amendment is added to the Constitution, which there's different paths to go there, but it includes both Congress and then state legislatures voting to approve the amendment before it gets added to the Constitution. Zan 2020 writes, "The Fourth Amendment is my top 3 most important amendments. Without it, the government would be able to invade our privacy as citizens. It also gives us ability to keep secrets we don't want to share. Fifth Amendment, protection from self-incrimination. Gives us the right not to get ourselves into trouble. Sixth Amendment, someone writes, "Because if we were framed and there was proof you did not commit the crime, you don't have to go to jail for something you did not do." And the Sixth Amendment is important because we had an argument, we'd be able to talk it out instead of fighting about it. And in the comments, Some folks are also just putting in the numbers of the amendments that they think are the most important, their top three. So I see 3, 4, and 8, 1, 4, and 8, 1, 5, and 8. Hopefully a couple of you said the link wasn't working. Hopefully you got to that new window to see the link working. If for some reason that didn't work for you, then you can follow the lead from some folks here, or just writing in their top three in the comments. And it's okay. I see some of you are asking each other why you picked those three, so it's okay to make those comments too. So some folks are writing under the 14th Amendment because everybody is protected, nobody gets hurt. This is the most important because it seems we're still working on it. Excellent point. So these amendments protect rights that the courts are always interpreting over the decades, ever since the amendments were added, interpreting and defining for us over time. Really, really good point. Under the Second Amendment, we have support for it, the ability to protect ourselves and communities. Someone else writes, unfortunately, I think this amendment is often misused today. When the founding fathers wrote this amendment, people use single fire and reload muskets. So again, you can, if you disagree with some of these amendments, you can write them in. Let's take about another minute to add our opinions here. And even if you're not adding an opinion on here, just scroll through these different opinions, see which ones seem most persuasive to you.
I see a lot of good ones for the 14th. That this is important because the rights should all be equal and have equal protection.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the 14th, this helps everyone to be equal, so nothing is unfair.
All right, so perhaps you've seen some persuasive arguments here. Seems like mostly for one amendment or the other. A couple are critical of certain amendments, which is okay too. Coming up on your screen, there should be a poll, a window that has a poll. And you can choose your 3 amendments. Just choose 3 from the list here. Oh, okay, so here we have our poll results. We've got, what does it look like to you, Gracie?
There's a lot, primarily for the First Amendment. 84% for the First Amendment, 58% for the 14th, 58% for the 8th Amendment. Yeah, those are the top 3, and then another one that was really popular was the 4th Amendment with 45%.
Do those results seem to you to be surprising, or maybe what you might have thought? What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, especially from seeing the responses in the chat and on the other page. That's typically what people were saying and making more points for. And yeah, I think that I understand why people would choose those and have their thoughts and input on those.
Yeah, I agree. The First Amendment, I would have thought that we would get results just like we saw here. So now we've seen what our group assembled here thinks of the rights that they would keep. And in the comments or the chat section, you can write your comments about what you think about the results that we had. So we had the First Amendment, the 8th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment. Whether that was surprising to you or whether that seems about right, that if those were the amendments, the only amendments to keep, the only fundamental rights to keep, do you agree? Do you think those would be the most important fundamental rights? Let's take a look. Was it hard for you to decide on which amendments? Which rights were easiest for you to give up and why? You can answer these questions in the chat area. You can answer one or more of these questions, totally up to you. You also might want to make a comment, how would our society be different if we were limited to the 3 rights that you chose? Was there anything surprising that you learned about the Bill of Rights or the Constitution today?
This comment really stood out to me. We were forced to make a decision. Where did it go? We were forced to make a decision about our life if it was not how it is today. Interesting how I chose protection over liberty.
And it was difficult to pick only 3. And you know what? This activity is set up to be difficult. It's set up to be not an easy choice to pick the top three. Because then you really have to think about what do I most value? Which rights are the most important to me? They're all important, but which ones really stand out in my mind as the most important ones? So on the CRF website, which is crf-usa.org, and I'll put the link in the chat area here, under curriculum materials, we have holidays and commemorations, and we have one for Constitution Day. And here you will see a version of this lesson, Visitor from Outer Space. We have a version for grades 3 through 5, for middle school, grades 6 through 8, and grades 9 through 12. You'll need to log in to download a PDF of the lesson. And for this PowerPoint, we'll be sure to include this PowerPoint as well for you to be able to use. And do you have any last comments, Gracie, before we finish out our webinar for today?
I don't think so, no. It was really cool to see everybody's input and, everyone's own personal opinions on everything and how they feel.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I want to thank you so much, Gracie, for joining us today and for taking us through that activity too. On our page, which is Resources for Learning in the Time of COVID-19, which we have linked on our homepage and through our curriculum materials page, we have upcoming webinars, and I will share this link as well. Coming up next week, we have My Town and the 3 branches of government for elementary school. And we also have archived webinars, one of which is The Common Good, Empowering Yourself from Your Couch, which also features our co-host today, Gracie, as well as some other students who hosted that. And Public Policy, a crash course in real time, talking about public policy and how to take civic actions as well related to public policy and understanding public policy through a distance learning platform like we're using today. So again, I want to thank everyone for being part of this, and we'll see you again at our next online webinar. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.